Welcome back to Fabric School, the series where I, a textile technologist, tell you how fabrics are actually made. In the last couple of videos, I told you how to make the thread that you're going to need to actually make your fabrics, and now I finally want to get into how to make woven fabrics. So woven fabric usually consists out of two sets of threads. You have your warp thread, which goes lengthwise all along your fabric, and then you have your weft thread, which goes crosswise through your fabric. If you've ever woven yourself, you will have the warp thread in your little frame, and then you yourself are putting in the weft thread, which industrially, that is a machine. Obviously, all of that happens a lot quicker. But essentially, how are these threads actually holding together? Because you got one's going in this direction, the other one's in this direction. Just putting them on top of each other is not going to turn them into fabric. So what you need to be doing is you need to kind of be going up and under on certain points just to make sure that your threads are holding on to something. And this can be done in tons of different patterns, but that is just the basics. Threads going in two different directions and crossing over and under each other to hold on to each other and make one surface. So your very first step that you're going to have to do to prep for weaving fabric. You are going to get your thread delivered on spools, something like this. They're going to be twice as high and like 3 times as wide as this one, so a lot chunkier, but this is essentially the shape they're going to come in. Now, for weaving, what you want your warp thread, so the one that's going to go along the length of your fabric. You want all of those next to each other on one singular spool. So, let's say your fabric is 150 wide, so 150 centimeters. You have 10 threads per centimeter, so now you need 1,500 threads put onto a spool that looks something like this. Imagine the spool is almost 2 meters wide and 1.5 meters thick. And now you're going to have parallel 1,500 threads on here. The way you're going to do this is you're going to put a ton of these spools onto a weird little contraption, and you're going to pull off the thread off of all those at the same time and put them onto here. That's one of the methods. There's another one which is a little bit more complicated, which you use for striped patterns that you don't produce a ton of, but that is the basic method. So you're going to get thread from those spools onto one humongous spool. Now, the very next step we're going to have to do is to prep our thread chemically. So the next process is called sizing, and essentially you pull all of those threads through a tub of water with certain types of chemicals in there. For example, a type of starch, and then you pull them out again, you squeeze all the rest of the water off, and you put them onto another spool that looks like this. You do this to strengthen your threads. I'm not going to go into what happens chemically specifically, but essentially you are putting something onto your thread to make it stronger, to actually last in the process and not fall apart. If you've watched the entirety of this series, this is the reason that when we have our threads made and we're putting them onto these spools, we are not waxing them the way we are for knitted threads. I said that we are waxing the threads which we will later use for knitting, but not the ones for weaving. And that is because in weaving, we have our own treatment for those threads, which is the sizing. I want to help you visualize what weaving thread actually looks like on an industrial machine. And to do that, I have a video of a model that is in the Technik Museum in Berlin, which helps to visualize how the entire process actually works. So what you're seeing here is the pink threads and the yellow threads. Those are supposed to be the warp threads, which go along the fabric itself. Then you have those wooden pieces. Those are so-called shafts, and going out from those wooden pieces downwards is little metal pieces. Those are called heels. I believe that's how you pronounce it in English. Those heels have holes in them towards the middle, and every single warp thread goes through one of those holes in the heels. So you have two different shafts. So the pink ones all go through the holes in the front shaft, and the yellow ones all in the back shaft. Now what's going to start happening is the shafts are going to start moving. The front one is going up, holding up all of the pink warp threads, and now a weft thread is inserted from the side. Then the shafts are going to change position and another weft thread is going to be inserted from the side. On the actual machine, all of those weft threads will be coming from one and the same side, but for the purpose of this model, building it like this was easier. But usually they all come from one side. So for context, a little while back, I made a video telling you the difference between silk and satin, and I said that satin was a so-called weave. Weaves are exactly what we're going to be talking about today. There's 3 different types. There is number 1, the plain weave. Plain weave just means that your weft thread, which is coming from the side, is going over one of the warp threads, under the next, over the next one, the second weft thread, under, over, under. So just interchangeably over one, under one. Then comes the twill weave. For the twill weave, you will be going, for example, over one thread, then under 2, and then over one thread again. And because of the way the twill weave works, you will have optically this diagonal line in your fabric, which you can see when you look at your denim, because denim fabric is made from a twill weave fabric. Now, satin is the last of the main 3 weaves, and that one you will have your thread going under one of the warp threads and then over a couple of them, and that is what makes it prone to snagging. These are only the 3 main weave types. There's a lot more. And today I want to talk to you about the selvage. What is the selvage? The selvage is the side edge, or both of the side edges, of a woven fabric. That part is woven slightly differently to make sure that the fabric doesn't just come undone, because essentially it is just held together by crossing threads over and under each other. So there are 3 main types. Number 1, the conventional selvage. That's the one you would have used if you've ever woven in one of these tiny frames. And essentially it means you take your weft thread, you go from one side to the other, you continue with that exact same thread and go to the other side again. On big industrial machines, you don't use that. You do one of the following. You either tuck in your selvage, which means you have a small piece of your weft thread that is hanging over on the side. You then tuck it in and weave it in when you're weaving in your next weft thread. And that way you have a loop going around your outermost warp thread and making sure nothing slides around. That selvage, by the way, is what they refer to when they say selvage denim, because you create your pattern pieces in a way that your selvage is the side edge of your pattern pieces for your leg. Or you do a leno selvage. There you have a different type of thread in the warp direction, which kind of wraps around and in between like the ends of the weft thread to secure them and make sure nothing slides around. I want to explain to you how the weft thread is inserted into your fabric. There are 3 main ways to actually insert your weft fabric. Number 1 is rapier weaving, where essentially you have 2 clamps coming from either side of the machine. You have one which takes the thread to the middle, then gives it to the second one, and that one takes the thread all the way to the back. And then you just keep on repeating that. That is how your weft threads are put into your fabric. The second version is projectile weaving, where you have a projectile. In the back of that projectile, you have a little clamp. That clamp will hold onto your thread, and then you shoot off that projectile, and that projectile will take your weft thread from one side of the machine to the other, where it will then go into a brake system, which will slow it down and stop it. And then the third version is air jet weaving, where you essentially just have a bunch of high pressure air blowing the thread through the machines. And you cannot talk about woven fabrics without mentioning the grain line. So very quickly, what is the grain line? In your woven fabric, you have lengthwise your warp threads, crosswise your weft threads, and your grain line follows the direction of your warp threads. If any of the threads are stronger in your woven fabric, it is more likely to be the warp threads than the weft threads. So if you're making a pair of pants, for example, and it's telling you to follow the grain line, it wants you to cut the pattern piece out in this direction to make sure that you have the strongest part in your lengthwise direction. If it's telling you to cut your fabric on the bias, that means it wants you to cut on the diagonal grain line, essentially. So why is that? If you cut your fabric on the diagonal, that just means that it's going to be a lot more flexible in its length, which is perfect for some pieces, not so good for others. So follow your pattern instructions whenever you're sewing, and if you make your patterns up yourself, maybe play around with it and figure out if maybe that piece shouldn't actually be cut on the grain line and it would be better on the bias, because that is one thing that I definitely did not do enough when I started sewing. Today, I am wrapping up my series on woven fabrics and telling you what woven fabrics can be used for. So aside from being able to be used for a lot of home textiles such as curtains and bedding and upholstery, they can also be used for more functional things such as airbags or the carbon fiber component in, let's say, a bike or tennis rackets, and many other functions. But when it comes to garments, you will use them for anything that you want to be more strong, rigid, stiff, and have no stretch. For example, the puff sleeves or the tiered skirt in this dress. Also, pants, most of the time, unless you're making sweatpants, button-up shirts, all of those are made from woven fabrics. Most of the time you'll be making skirts from woven fabrics, jackets, anything that isn't stretchy, essentially. You can make woven fabric stretchy, either the tiniest bit stretchy by cutting it out on the bias or by adding elastane into it. But naturally, woven fabric isn't really stretchy. For that, you would use jersey or other knitted fabrics, which I will be getting into right after wrapping up this little series.